Hello, my name is Tej van Pettinger from Economics Help, and today we're going to look at GDP, Gross Domestic Product, what it measures and what its limitations are. So first of all, GDP measures national income, which is the same as national output and expenditure. So basically it's a marketable value of everything produced. If a firm sells £1,000 worth of goods, that's added to gross domestic product. So the more produced, the more that we buy, higher the GDP is. And so very roughly, it is a guide to economic output and to a lesser extent economic welfare. Because when GDP rises, we can buy more goods and services. And if you look across the world, GDP per capita can vary enormously. In sub-Saharan Africa, it can be as low as $200, $300 per capita, whereas in the United States, GDP per capita is more in the region of $30,000 or $40,000 per year. So that shows a huge disparity in output and income between those different areas of the economy. Now, GDP arose in the 1930s and 1940s, and at the time, governments wanted better statistics about the state of the economy. And a big factor was the Great Depression, because it was estimated that in the Great Depression, economic output fell between 30 and 50%. So the United States, Europe, all around the world, huge fall in output and income. The economic cycle really broke down. And so, understandably, governments and economists wanted better statistics, what's actually happening to the economy. And so in the UK, GDP was first published in 1944. And in the 1930s, the US investigated the best way to measure national output as a response to the Great Depression. And GDP was never intended as a guide to economic welfare, but almost by default, it became a measure of welfare because it's such a prominent statistic and it's very easy to compare. But although GDP is very useful for looking at the economic cycle and trying to manage that, there are many limitations when we try to make a comparison between GDP and welfare for quite a few reasons. So first of all, GDP measures anything that is produced. So if you cause a big oil spill and then you have a high output to fix your environmental disaster, this actually increases GDP because you're spending all the money on pollution and then cleaning it up. But you can't say that welfare has increased because it's just defensive spending. Also, if you were to have rapid economic growth and everyone can afford to buy a car, but then there's very bad traffic congestion, this would increase GDP, but if you're stuck in congestion and traffic jams, then that's not increasing your welfare because you're wasting your time. You're spending money on not doing anything productive. So if you look at China, China's had economic growth of around 10% a year, but it's also caused all these externalities, external problems of pollution, congestion, degradation of environment. So the actual increase in welfare is very different to the headline statistics. Another thing about GDP is that it underestimates activity but is not measured. You may remember a 1970s sitcom called The Good Life. Basically, a couple give up their jobs to become self-sufficient in their back garden. And from a GDP point of view, it would show a fall in GDP because their income went from $10,000 a year to basically zero because they were growing their own food. But the point of the sitcom was that growing your own food, having no money, can actually be very rewarding. So if people are self-sufficient, this underestimates GDP. But also if you spend time caring for people or doing voluntary charity work, this is not measured by GDP because there's no monetary transaction. But obviously housework, often done by women, caring, again often done by women, is not included in GDP. So it's only a partial reflection of what is actually happening. Another interesting aspect of GDP is that it doesn't include free goods. Now, free goods in this sense, I'm going to think about that you can use for no cost. There is some opportunity cost, but if you use Instagram, you take photos, use the internet, the amount you pay is quite little, but you're getting a big use of entertainment and goods and services to you. So for example, 10 years ago, you would have to buy a camera, an alarm clock, a tape measure, but now you can get all these things in one item, a phone. So in a way, we're spending less but getting more because of technology, and GDP doesn't necessarily reflect that. But I think a much more serious concern about GDP is that it is looking at output which doesn't necessarily translate into welfare, and GDP excludes things like inequality. So for example, you could have a big increase in GDP, but at the same time poverty remains, because GDP may go towards big companies who make more profit or a few very rich people. And if you look at this graph from the United States, it shows a disparity between growth in GDP per capita and growth in median incomes. So median incomes is the average wage that an American gets, and this is lagging far behind GDP. And there's a famous point in the 2016 Brexit referendum where they were discussing the impact of Brexit, and one economist said, just imagine a big fall in GDP. And somebody in the audience said, but that's your GDP. And it's kind of interesting that even ordinary people don't relate to GDP because, as we saw in that graph, there can be a big increase in GDP, but many people don't see their living standards increasing. So it is important to look at median wages, what's actually happening. Also, things that increase living standards may be healthcare, education, life expectancy, amount of leisure time. Do you have to work 60 hours a week to get high GDP, or can you enjoy a lot of leisure time? So all these things are limitations of GDP. Also, perhaps an even bigger concern for GDP is the impact on environmental sustainability. So we can increase GDP by extracting coal, burning it in the power station and getting energy. All this relates to higher output, higher economic growth. But it is causing pollution, contributing to global warming, and possibly causing very serious consequences for the long term of the economy and society. So this short-term increase in GDP is masking a much bigger problem down the road. So some people suggest as an alternative to GDP, we look at green GDP, which is taking away environmental degradation. So GDP does have its uses. We shouldn't neglect it completely because it's very useful for looking at the economic cycle. But it's a mistake to see it as a measure of welfare, because welfare and living standards is much more than the output and income in society. Are there any alternatives to GDP? Well, yes, there are. The first problem is there's too many. It's almost like everybody wants to create their own alternative to GDP, which leads to a proliferation. And this makes it hard for people to fix on one alternative, whereas GDP doesn't really have any competitors. There's gross national product, but that's very similar. So just briefly, the alternatives to GDP include the genuine progress indicator. This is like GDP, but tries to look at a broader range of statistics, looking at life expectancy, education, and it's much easier to increase GDP than the actual genuine progress indicator, because you need a better range of improvements in factors that increase living standards. There's also the Human Development Index, which is a measure of how developed a society is, and the access to education, healthcare, and literacy is important. There's the Human Poverty Index, which measures the equality of distribution. And there's a lot of measures which try to take into account environmental factors. So we look at GDP, but take away environmental costs. And these include things like the Happy Planet Index. So policymakers are trying to look beyond GDP, Many countries like New Zealand and the UK are looking at welfare, well-being indexes, where they actually look at a broader range of factors such as mental health, happiness, literacy and life expectancy. And this will give a bigger picture. And it's something that will definitely help in the future developing economic policy, because the goal was never to maximise GDP. The goal should be to maximise a sustainable increase in living standards.